I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I'm good? We've been having problems with my mic lately, so I apologize. Do not think that I have come to the earth to bring peace. I don't come to bring peace, but a sword. I don't come to bring peace, but a sword. It's a tough gospel. I remember years ago sitting in church one Sunday morning and hearing a very difficult gospel passage. It may even have been this one, and thinking to myself, I can't wait to hear what Father's going to say about this one. It came time for the sermon, and he preached on the Old Testament passage. It was then, before I knew God was calling me to become a preacher, that I said to myself, Self, don't ever duck the tough passages. Fast forward about 6 or 8 years later, and this morning we hear Jesus say, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. Got to say it again, that's a tough passage. What do you do with that? This statement from Jesus about wielding this weapon of violence, it's a far cry from most, if not all, of the other statements Jesus makes. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Love your neighbor as yourself. That just makes it that much harder to understand what Jesus is talking about when he says, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. I think it's helpful if we put this statement in context. Jesus is living during a period of time where Judea is occupied by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had this idea, they called it the Pax Romana, or the peace of Rome. It was civil peace at all costs. The Pharisees, the religious leaders of Judea at the same time, bought into this Pax Romana because it helped maintain their status. They had a place in the system. So they too were looking for this civil peace. So when Jesus comes out and says things like, unless your righteousness passes that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you have no place in heaven, it shakes up that system. So we come to today's lesson. And here in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is sending out the 12 disciples to continue to do that work of rabble-rousing and shaking the system, bringing attention to inequality and injustice. And he tells them, be careful, because you might face hatred. You might face inquisitions. You might be beaten. You might even be killed. That's okay. Don't be afraid. He says, don't be afraid 3 times in this passage. 3 times, do not be afraid. Jesus is addressing those who seek to live out the Christian faith. While facing the conflict, the gospel message is sure to produce. Conflict is inevitable because this radical gospel, this gospel of love, is also a gospel of justice. And it's justice for everyone, not just for those in a position of power. So to reinforce this idea, Jesus tells them, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. Let's look at that word peace. In the Greek, it's a word called eirene. And if you look it up, there's several alternative translations to the word eirene. The first one that pops up is a state of national tranquility. It's interesting. Harmony, concord, security, prosperity are all alternate translations for this word that we put in as peace. Kind of sounds like the Pax Romana, doesn't it? Peace, tranquility. That's what the Roman Empire wanted. That's what the Pharisees wanted. But Irene comes at a cost. This tranquility, this harmony, this prosperity and security, it comes at a cost. And the cost is equality. The cost is justice. And that's what Jesus came to disrupt. He came to disrupt that peace that comes at the cost of justice. He came to disrupt that peace that keeps people marginalized. So what then is the sword that Jesus is talking about? I don't think it's an actual sword. He tells Peter later in this gospel, put your sword away. I think this sword is a metaphorical sword. I think the sword that Jesus is talking about bringing is the gospel. It's the gospel of truth. It's the gospel of love. It's the gospel of equality. It's the gospel of justice for all of God's children. It's that gospel of justice. It's that gospel of truth that disrupts peace. It disrupts complacency. It disrupts a system that's set up to keep people marginalized. Justice forces those in authority and in positions of power. Justice forces us to examine those systems. And that is anything but peaceful. Our nation continues in this continued season of unrest because of some of these instances of injustice and inequality that we've seen highlighted. God calls each one of us. God calls each one of us in our baptismal vows. Every time we renew our baptismal vows, we promise to God and to each other that we will strive for justice. The justice of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But how do we do justice? How do we wield that sword that Jesus talks about? I heard a sermon several years ago, and I remember it quite vividly even today. It's stuck with me for the last 4 or 5 years. I was at the National Cathedral, and the gentleman preaching that morning was a man named Brian Stevenson. Mr. Stevenson is an attorney, and he's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. This group in the state of Alabama promises legal representation to people who've been condemned to death row. He also does a lot of work with the juvenile justice system in the state of Alabama. And he's seen firsthand some of the injustices that our system continues to perpetrate even today. And he had 4 suggestions for the way that people of faith could wield that sword that Jesus is talking about this morning. 4 ways that we can all do justice. The first way Mr. Stevenson suggested that we could do justice is we have to get proximate. We have to get close to the problem. We have to go where there's inequality. We have to go where there's injustice. We have to see it firsthand. We can hear about it on the news. We can listen to it on the radio. And we never really get an appreciation of the intricacies of these injustices. We never see firsthand, we never hear the stories for ourselves of inequality. The second thing Mr. Stevenson suggests that we do is we change the narrative. For a long time in this country, we've heard politicians talk about law and order and about making sure that we maintain civil authority. I don't want to draw a direct correlation here, but does that sound familiar? The narrative, one of the narratives that Mr. Stevenson talks about is this narrative that there's children in our country that are unredeemable. 17, 16, 15, 14, 13-year-old children who the system calls super predators. And because they're labeled this way, Because society has determined that these children are not really children. They face the adult criminal justice system. We have 14-year-old children in this country who are condemned to 10, 15-year prison sentences as adults in adult institutions. We have to change that narrative, especially when that narrative that we have these super predators in our country, most of the time those children that we call super predators are children of color. The third thing that we have to do, Mr. Stevenson says, is we have to stay hopeful. We have to stay hopeful that these systems and these structures will someday change. Because if we don't stay hopeful, we'll give up. We're called as Christians to be hopeful. Hope is what makes us stand up and fight for justice and equality, even when a system tells us to sit down and to be quiet. And the fourth thing Mr. Stevenson suggests that we do is we commit to being uncomfortable. Conversations about race, conversations about inequality, conversations about injustice are uncomfortable. But we have to commit to having those conversations, or there is no justice and equality that Jesus came to bring. We have to commit to being uncomfortable, or we have no shot at being proximate to the problem. We have no shot at changing the narrative. We have to commit to being uncomfortable. Sisters and brothers, this is not an easy gospel. The gospel of love, the gospel of justice is not easy. But God calls us. God calls us to pick up that sword that Jesus is talking about and do justice.